Bienvenido a un nuevo evento de Cátedra Europa.
Good afternoon. On behalf of the 24th edition of Cadre Europa, we will give you a very warm welcome to the panel Formas y fondos en el cine de Alfred Hitchcock. Hitchcock, the frightened boy and the frightened filmmaker, for which we have the special participation of Mr. Olivier Kapperner, producer and managing director at Parkville Pictures. Moderating the session will be Juan Pablo Osman, professor of social communication at Universidad del Norte, Masters of Arts in Filmmaking, and currently waiting to receive his PhD in communication. We will now leave you with Professor Juan Pablo Osman. Welcome, everyone.
Hello, welcome, everyone. Thank you all for your assistance. Thank you for Fiorella. And thank you, Olivier, for being here and accepting our invitation. And so let me introduce briefly Olivier Kempfer. So he's a producer and managing director at Parkville Pictures, named as one of Screen International's future leaders, BAFTA-nominated producer. He founded the London-based independent production company Parkville Pictures, and he received also the Grand Jury Prize for the Miseducation of Cameron Post at the Sundance Film Festival. And their coming slate includes co-productions with Working Title Films, BFI, Oscar-nominated U.S. producer James Shamus, and BBC Films, while their TV slate includes co-productions with New Regency TV and Amazon Italy. Welcome, Olivier. How are you?
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me. Nice to see some sunshine over there. Over here in London, we haven't seen it in years, but it's nice.
How are you? Welcome.
Thank you very much. Well, no, it's fantastic to be here, and like I said, it's great to have you introduce me, especially because we, of course, know each other from film school in London. So the connection to UK cinema is shared between us both. So it's a nice premise for this conversation.
Yes, I think that's the first thing we need to clarify. This is going to be more like a friends conversation. We've known each other for a long time. As Olivia said, we went to film school, to London Film School together, and we built a very good friendship and a good as well. I would say an obsession with Alfred Hitchcock. No, so that's
very
why,
much so.
Yeah, so that's why we are here, and we're gonna talk about our approach and our opinions and our insight on Hitchcock and Hitchcock filmmaking and his cinema in general. So yeah, I'm gonna start sharing a presentation we've prepared. So just give me a second, and yes, there we go. Okay. So yeah, I'm sharing, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So yeah, basically we've named this presentation "The Frightened Boy and the Frightening Filmmaker." We're going to explain why we decided to put this title. First, just a short introduction on Hitchcock. Well, he's got 5 Academy Award nominations for Best Director with Rebecca in 1940, Lifeboat in 1944, Spellbound in 1945, Rear Window in 1954, and Psycho in 1960. Rebecca was the only film Hitchcock directed that won the Academy Award for Best Picture, and 4 of his films were selected by the American Film Institute as among the 100 greatest American movies. And here we're going to start with the first subject, we want to address, and Hitchcock is a very interesting character and interesting figure because, of course, he's British, and well, we are now talking in a British framework, but most of his filmography, and most of his most successful films were made in the U.S., including Vertigo, Psycho, Rear Window, and North by Northwest. In fact, Hitchcock directed 53 films in total, but 31 of those films were made in America in that period from 1940 to 1976. So I think I would say that could be the first question. Olivier, I mean, you're the British here, and how do you see Hitchcock in terms of how much does he belong to the British culture and the British society? Do you think, despite he moved to America and most of his career he developed it in America, and most of his most successful films were made there, do you think he can be considered part of British culture, part of British national spirit?
I'd say very much so. I mean, you know, certainly for, first of all, a country the size of United Kingdom, even though it has left a big mark on international cinema, it is something that it is used to, that its great directors, its great actors have often ended up in the United States. So I think the British cinema would be left with not very much if it defined British talent by those who stayed and made all of their work in the UK. There just are not many. But also, given the time, you know, I think despite that he spent such a huge part of his career in the US, he made a lot of films in the UK. In fact, some of them, you know, have been lost and are not, you know, easily findable anymore. They were in the early silent era. And his body of work, and we're going to get into this, it remained very, you can see so many consistent themes through the films that he made in the UK to those in the US. You recognize very much Hitchcock, the filmmaker, from his time in the UK, in his films later on in the UK, in the US, and even his US films. You know, people will say, you know, the American language that is used, the characters and the way they perform, there is a certain kind of British quality to it. And Hitchcock was always thought of as a British filmmaker, even when he was in America. And obviously, you know, we'll get into the key theme here of fear, but really his identity as a filmmaker was built here in the UK, and so he is very much revered as a British icon of cinema, and he's not seen at all like a traitor who went to the US.
Yeah, we should remind that Hitchcock moved to the US in 1939 with a 7-year contract signed with David O. Selznick, the American producer, the production company. And yeah, when he moved, he was already a well recognized and well-known director, established director. And one of the things, yeah, in 1940, when he directed Foreign Correspondent, the film, that was like the point where he started like merging, and you could still see all those traces you were talking about. Especially, I think, Olivier, we can talk about humor. No, that's, I think, one of the trademarks he never left behind, even moving to America. Don't you think so?
100%. You know, obviously, that distinct British humor is something that defines most British filmmaking, but it's particularly hard, perhaps, at the time, especially, you know, it wasn't necessarily the best moment in British and American political relations right at the beginning of the Second World War. They had quite different viewpoints on it. But his version of that comic tone was very much embraced by the US producers that had brought him over. They allowed him to very much explore that within the US cultural setting. But, you know, while he did manage to carry it over, I think that's probably one of the things where if you do look at his body of work, you look at, let's say, some of his earlier films, something like The Lodger, you know, in the UK, which was one of his early features, you know, of course, you have some of the similar themes that you might see later on in North by Northwest or any of his you know, most famous American films, whether it's the suspense and the intrigue and the particular type of imagery to provoke those very haunting moments. It doesn't quite have some of the what British people call camp fun, you know, where it's slightly less playful. There is, you know, subtle comedy, but it isn't quite the all-out playfulness that you find in his early British work. I mean, you can argue, and people have discussed this, is that because he's just someone who got older by that time? You know, does every filmmaker retain this sense of playful fun? I mean, if I think of even, you know, Stanley Kubrick, he's not British, of course, but is another filmmaker that we've spent hours and hours talking about. You know, his early work contains far more comedy than his later work, and
it's funny because he did it the other way around. He moved from the States to the UK, and that's when he lost that sense of humor.
Exactly, it's true. Ironically, so it's a tricky one to kind of know for sure. But I think, you know, humor wasn't, let's say, his key driver. You know, and we've talked about the frightened boy, the frightening filmmaker. I think humor is often described as something to deflect fear, but maybe as he got older, he embraced and faced the main inspiration behind his filmmaking, which is fear. If you know, there are not many filmmakers that have such distinct and consistent motivation behind the stories that they tell as Hitchcock. You know, he never went off and just did a romantic comedy, or he never, you know, if it was always things that dealt with suspense and fear. And while most psychologists, whether we're talking about human beings or filmmakers, would say that what we do in life is driven by our fears, we normally kind of focus on the symptoms of the fears, whether it's insecurity about where we are in life, or love, sex, identity, whatever it might be. Hitchcock was obsessed with fear itself, you know, and that in itself is quite fascinating. And yeah, speaking of,
and I would say unique as well in the history of film.
You know, you have for sure some filmmakers that have maybe explored fear, you know, whether you're talking about Michael Mann or you know, people that have maybe spent a career dealing in horror, but
even maybe Steven Spielberg in certain.
Perhaps, as I say, you know, you could argue that all of humanity is driven by fear in one way or another. Fear of safety, fear of economic security, fear to not be loved. All these types of things are all driven by fear. Whereas I think Hitchcock had a very clever way of, you know, often presenting very sophisticated characters, elegant characters, people who are perceived to have be in control of the fears around them and find ways to subvert that. And it's probably because he is someone who had dealt with, since a very, very young age, very crippling fears. And, you know, this slide touches upon it. As a young child, and we learn about this later on in life through interviews, but yeah, he was, as it says here, born, you know, to very, very strict Catholic parents, not with a lot of economic comfort, the turn of the 19th century. And he was an unfortunate child. You know, he had a glandular condition, which meant that he was very overweight. So he felt very isolated in any case. And his father was not someone who, well, when he was alive, as it says here, you know, his father died when Hitchcock was 14, but, you know, he was, when he was alive, a very tough father, and one that didn't necessarily help with Alfred's fears. And then, of course, to lose your father at that age is a very, very difficult moment, and suddenly fear and your isolation, if you don't have many friends, or self-confidence, becomes worse. And, you know, there are things that we don't touch upon in the slides here, but famously, you know, Hitchcock was terrified of eggs. You know, he was, you know, not as a kind of funny, you know, haha, I'm scared of eggs. He was actually terrified of eggs. So this is a man who
he couldn't actually see them, you know.
No, I know. Perhaps that's why you love Hitchcock so much, because I know you have a slight fear of eggs. But anyway,
True.
But this is not about your It is not about your psychoanalysis. It's more about Hitchcock. So yeah, so here is someone who, you know, was obviously very much driven by fear, and as we know, fear is a very, very creative power, and the imagery that one conjures in your mind. We're used to it now because we have so much media around, but cinema at the time, especially if we think of, silent cinema, the imagery had to be so impactful and it would have to provoke emotion, whether it was the early vampire films you would have seen as, or not films, but let's.
Okay, I think we lost Olivia for a second. So yeah, we were talking about the obsession of Hitchcock with fear in general, and that was something that was part of his life, as we were saying, since he was a very young kid. And the first time Hitchcock actually openly admitted this condition, and the fact that he grew up as a very fearful boy was in that very famous interview that Hitchcock had with famous French director Francois Truffaut in 1961. And there he came with this, I mean, absurd story where apparently Alfred Hitchcock's father took him to the police station when he was just a kid, and he gave a note to the officer, and the officer read the note, and apparently it said that he had to lock him away for 10 minutes as punishment for behaving badly. And imagine that for a kid who was just like 5 or 6 years old at the time. And then the officers told Alfred, okay, this is what we do to naughty boys. So the story, of course, has often been challenged, and throughout his life, Hitchcock changed a lot of these details. But for example, Hitchcock, sorry about that. Okay. So Hitchcock's sister always claimed the story to be true, and he always said this created a whole fear, not only towards, of course, the situation, but towards police itself and the figure of authority itself that created a conflict in Hitchcock throughout his entire life. For example, he never he was never interested in getting a driving license because he couldn't admit the idea of being pulled over by a policeman, and that's fascinating. I don't know if you're back with us, Olivier. No, not yet.
Yeah.
Okay.
I now can. Yeah, sorry. I was waiting. Unfortunately, it cut out, and then I was waiting backstage. So hopefully, next time, if that happens, I'll be let back in quickly. But sorry about that. I was hearing everything you were saying about the story in the police station.
Yes. Which is a key anecdote and a key story for his life, his entire life, but also his entire cinema. In fact,
Yeah, and as we said, there's so many films and so many characters where we see policemen that are characters to be scared of, characters to be suspicious of. I mean, just look at this kind of imagery. I'm yes. terrified just even looking at it. And
that
he was someone.
That close-up is genius, and all of us remember that policeman, getting to Marion in her car,
Totally. And I mean, you may have already told this anecdote, but Hitchcock, again, being someone who's terrified of eggs and can't then have breakfast, he was so scared of being pulled over. Have you already told this?
Yes. I just said it, but But go on.
No, they're so scared of being pulled over by police, and that he didn't even drive. Yeah. And so this is someone who was so obsessed with fear. And it's probably why, yes, his films, when we go back to the question of is he British or is he American, it's probably why he was able to translate internationally so quickly, because I think fear in that sense is very universal, the imagery of fear, the source of fear, but also why it doesn't necessarily change too much between his films when he was making British cinema and films in America. The identity of Hitchcock as a filmmaker was so strong throughout. It's not you don't have so much of a kind of the British period and the US period, the same kind of characters, these same unsettling images and themes come throughout. But yeah, the police is a classic example of the repeated theme of triggers for Hitchcock.
Yep, and also we have them this other anecdote which I find fascinating as well. And Donald Scotto, in his book Alfred Hitchcock: The Hidden Face of Genius, in the words of Hitchcock himself, and I will read this literally because I think it's worth it. I remember when I was 5 or 6 years old. It was a Sunday night, the only time of the week when my parents didn't have to work. They put me to bed and went for a walk in Hyde Park. They were sure I was going to sleep until they returned. But I woke up, called out, and no one answered. Nothing but the night around me. Trembling, I got up, wandered all over the empty, gloomy house, and finally, reaching the kitchen, I found a piece of cold meat and began to eat it while weeping out my tears. First, this is a script, this is a storyline, I mean, you can see cinema, you can imagine and you can visualize every single scene. That's a short film there. But second, I mean, imagine that living that as a kid of 5 or 6 years old, how traumatized it can leave you, this kind of story and this kind of moment for your entire life, no?
But this also fascination, even though it's a story that he tells, and I don't know, you can never be 100% sure what is true. He is a storyteller, yeah, exactly, he's a filmmaker, exactly. And he was alone as a child. But yeah, there's the simple imagery of a child alone in the dark, eating a piece of cold meat, wiping away tears. I mean, genius. As you say, it is cinema in itself, and maybe it's true, maybe it is exactly how it happened.
Who cares?
But
who cares?
I mean, who cares? But the imagery is just so strong. How can we have imagery like with the birds, as simple as birds, white birds coming down and attacking someone with this kind of horror? These are images that, and as I said early on in the presentation, this bird on a cigar, just being there, okay, that's more for humor, but it's the absurd, it's the surreal, and it's the surrealness of the fear as well, that is so powerful with Hitchcock, because it manifests itself in him so strongly that it comes out. You can almost say like Dali is like a kind of surreal interpretation of imagination, and in some cases the magic of the imagination, and he is capable, perhaps not of quite surrealism, because it isn't surreal, but he is capable of quite distorted images that create a very simplistic sense of fear that you don't need to understand whether it's British or American or Spanish. The idea of, as going back to this story,
no? In the end,
which is why this story is so brilliant. If you tell this story of a child alone in the dark, eating a piece of cold meat and wiping away tears, I mean, I think that's something that is also not just scary, but it appeals to the scared child within everyone. And he is ultimately, of course, driven by, you don't have to be a professional psychologist. It's amateur psychology. This is what translates then into his cinema.
Totally. And now that you were saying like the fear inside every single one of us when we are kids, this is another quote that I find fascinating. Like, fear isn't so difficult to understand. After all, weren't we all frightened as children? I mean, there he's saying everything, like all his fears that he had when he was a child, then became a motif in his entire filmmaking, no? And then he goes again, fear, it has influenced my life, and this is very interesting, my life and my career. I mean, and that's why we ended up putting that title, because in the end, that's the whole point is he was a fearful boy who then became a frightening filmmaker. And Menendez, a Spanish writer who wrote the book El enemigo de las rubias, the enemy of the blondes, in 2021, he says also like what is clear is that the boy Alfred Hitchcock was fearful, and all that fear that he had when he was little, he gave it back to us as a kind of a revenge. I find that fascinating as well, and very interesting, because yeah, he's and there you can find that combination that we've been talking about between that obsession with fear and humor, because he's like all the time like laughing at all, like, okay, now you're gonna be afraid, and I'm gonna be laughing at you because of the fact of you being afraid. Don't you think so?
Totally. And well, it's interesting because I went to a retrospective of his films at the British Film Institute 2 years ago. There was a panel of leading British film critics, and in some ways, they discussed this kind of quote actually, and had a slightly different interpretation on it, or let's say a potential interpretation, in that his way of mastering the fear that had so been in control of him his whole childhood, his way of perhaps trying to find some kind of control over fear, was by exploring it through cinema, by encapsulating it in film. And this might be a little bit of a extension of interpretation, but there's even an argument that the opportunity to go to America and continue making these films on a bigger scale, with bigger budgets, with better known actors, with a wider audience, allowed him an even deeper.
Okay, I think we lost him again, but yeah, he'll be back and finish his point. But yeah, and another interesting aspect of Hitchcock was his relationship with his mother. And
Sorry, I'm back.
Don't worry. Okay. So finish your
Yeah,
point.
no,
Yeah.
the same. Yeah.
Yep. Are you there? Okay, so yeah, I was saying that another very interesting aspect of Hitchcock's life was the relationship with his mother, which, as we were saying, she was a very strict mother, Catholic, and she would punish Alfred Hitchcock, forcing him to stand at the foot of her bed for several hours, which is another powerful image. And there you can see as well, like in many of Hitchcock films, but especially in Psycho, there is a lot of connection, and there are a lot of links between this strict militant mother and this figure of mother, very strict and militant, and what he did in Psycho with the mother character, in that dark, creepy character he builds, which is a dead character, but at the same time is alive, which is another very important aspect in Hitchcock's cinema, and one of his main obsessions. Are you there again, Olivier?
Yeah, exactly. I was listening. I mean, you speak better than I. By the way, I apologize to everyone. There's just something happening in my local area with the internet cables, and it's driving me nuts. But anyway, no, I was just saying that that by going to America, it allows him a bigger and wider canvas to explore the obsessions and the fears that he had, and it's something that again, talking on this panel, the British Film Institute, no British cinephile or commentator in British cinema sees it as an abandoning of British cinema, but an export. But also, just going back, of course, the mother character, again, classic. If you were to have a kind of hypothetical scene of Hitchcock on a psychiatrist's sofa, I mean, it would be so easy. The female characters, the blonde woman that's through nearly all of his films, and as you say, the mother characters. Again, it's his therapy, dealing with these fears on the big screen, like I suppose so many filmmakers.
True, and then we have that anecdote with the police officer when he was a kid. We already saw how that created a fear towards police and authority in general, but also developed an obsession as well towards false guilt. And it's unbelievable the amount of films for this research, for this presentation, that we found where the false guilt subject is addressed in Hitchcock's cinema. And almost, there are like tons of films where the main character is falsely accused or there's a confusion and they think he's another person and that he's not that person. So that's another very interesting aspect, no? And it's totally related to that story and that anecdote he had when he was a kid, because yeah, he felt he was falsely accused and that he was put in jail, in a very unfair way. So that's very interesting, no?
Of course, it's the suspicion over justice, and having, it's again very basic connection of this story with being put in the police station and that fear, that 10 minutes in a jail cell, the impact that had on him at the time. And no doubt there are other instances, but this is the one that he, of course, revealed to Truffaut in that famous interview. Exactly. And as we've seen here, the kind of repetition of this particular theme, which isn't one that I, at least off the top of my head, is something that I've seen commonly in other filmmakers, this consistent false guilt, and the characters who are falsely accused of things. I mean, we've seen them here, whether it's in the 39 Steps, which is, of course, one of his major last British films, or you have Richard Blaney in The Necktie Murderer, being accused being accused of the necktie murder in Frenzy. Sorry, my brain. You have Jonathan Drew, The Lodger, accused of being the serial killer known as the Avenger, and The Lodger, another classic of the British films. And in fact, going, looking at these and looking back at these films, you can see how, despite that we're talking about fear, The Lodger and the 39 Steps, these are still films where we can still find elements of humor in there that he was very known of. But anyway, that's a separate, we're talking about fear, not humor. And then, of course, in The Wrong Man, Manny being accused of carrying out a series of robberies. These are persistent obsessions. Again, The Young and the Innocent, 1937, a classic. Robert Tisdale, falsely accused of murder. It's often always of quite dark things. It's normally being accused of murder. It's not being accused of stealing a cat. Again, here in North by Northwest, probably one of his most iconic films, Roger Thornhill being accused of being George Kaplan. This is not like one or two or three. I mean, he did make many films, so it's quite easy to find a consistent pattern for anything across all of them. But yes, it's very much an obsession of his. And obviously more powerful the false guilt is clearly more powerful a fear than the eggs, but still, it was very much there as a consistent theme.
True. Yeah, and well, to finish this conversation, this dialogue, we have created kind of, coming back to the humor thing, we have created kind of a top 5 of Hitchcock's creepiest moments, So yeah, well, we chose, I mean, this is totally based on our own criteria and taste and hours and hours of watching Hitchcock there in London while we used to share a flat.
Exactly. Well, I remember though watching the scene of breaking into the apartment in Rear Window. That must have been, I don't know, at about 10 a.m. first time we saw it in the cinema lecture room at London Film School. And that scene stayed with me. I mean, you don't anticipate being kind of shocked and terrified in that way in an academic setting, analyzing the films of Hitchcock. You're being totally conscious of the construct, yet nonetheless, this scene is so iconic and so powerful, and it just completely stayed with us, I think, ever since. I think I think maybe this was a screening where we came out as God, and we're like, oh my God, we need to buy all the Hitchcock DVDs we can find and watch all of them.
Yeah, exactly. That was a lot of years ago. Let's not say how many.
Just a couple.
Just a couple. And then we have number 4. We decided to put Margot when she almost gets murdered in Dial M for Murder, 1954. And you remember, this is a very creepy situation because her husband is the one who wants to get her killed because he finds out she has cheated on him, right?
Of course. And by the way, just to go back to the themes we talked about, another blonde woman here. It's a theme that people have commented on a lot, that there are always blonde women that kind of
and that's Grace Kelly, who also appears in Rear Window.
Of course, exactly. So clearly had a powerful vehicle for his themes there. And by the way, just on a side note, Dial M for Murder is got to be one of the great film titles. The simplicity of it, the elegance of it. Again, as I said, he was able to dress fear up in a very elegant. Even just look at this scene. You know, you have this this blonde woman with her lipstick and the nightgown, this black telephone, and the man behind dressed elegantly with the tie. And he's, you know,
what a sophisticated murderer as well.
Yeah, 100%. That there is and it might be because of, you know, his childhood and what he did not have in terms of growing up, but his characters were often, as I said before, those who were of a certain elegance, of a certain sophistication, and that obviously fascinated him a lot too. And this image right there, as you say, it's about as elegant a picture of pre-murder as you could imagine.
And let's remember that in the end, she ends up killing the murderer with a pair of scissors, and that's very creepy there. So yeah, and another interesting thing, Dial M for Murder was originally was a 3D film, but due to exhibition and distribution problems, then most of the screenings were 2D. But yeah, that's another important fact, because yeah, the vision of Hitchcock always, you know, trying to be ahead of time, and it was originally a 3D film, one of the first 3D films in history. But yeah, most of the screenings and the distribution was 2D. So number 3, so of course the reveal of Mrs. Bates in Psycho, of course, iconic moment.
Iconic, perhaps slightly less. I mean, after I've just said all of this about the elegance of his imagery, I mean, this is perhaps where we get
even there. I mean, the woman is like perfectly dressed, and her hair is perfect. So even there, you can find some kind of sophistication. It's not like just the corpse there. You know what I mean?
No, in fact, and that's actually what helps with the impact, because it's the surprise, the reveal of this completely petrifying image of the face, but the elegance, as you say, the hair, the clothes, the corpses, again, almost a subversion of the imagery that he's created for us. But yeah, I think, you know, the top 5 of Hitchcock's creepiest moments, I'd kind of pick about 20 from Psycho. I think Psycho has to be just one of the whole film is a creepy moment. It's 90 minutes of creep.
True. Although I must say, like, I find, and then there we go to number 2, I find the whole plot and the whole script of Under Capricorn so bizarre and so dark. I mean, this woman who is in love with the housekeeper, and she falls in love with the owner of the house. So she tries to make the wife look like she's totally mad, and that's why she puts this head under the bed sheets of the woman to make people think that she's having hallucinations and declare her mad, so she can keep the man for herself. I mean, what a drama! What is that?
But
I mean, that script, I've always found it so
but this
bizarre.
Is totally, and this touches back on, I think, on one of the reasons why he's able to capture the imagination so strongly, is his understanding of the surreal as well. You know,
and
as I say,
and the games of the mind. Yeah. Exactly.
Totally. And you know, obviously, it's, as I say, I use Dali as a loose, silly comparison, because he's not being so overtly surreal, but he knows how to create subversive imagery. As I say, whether it's playful, there's so many photos of Hitchcock, which are just publicity photos where he has positioned himself in a surreal setting, whether it's, you know, with a bird on his cigar or whatever it might be. And his, even the policeman that we see earlier in the presentation, just the way he's framed in the car window, his face, the glasses, there's something almost inhuman. It's a play on the surreal imagery. So that elegance and the surreal quality of the imageries create I think a great kind of juxtaposition of the type of subversive fears he's exploring. And yeah, Under Capricorn is perhaps one of the most let's say clear in its exploration of subversive and almost surreal imagery, and that's why I think that one just stays in the mind, you know, more than perhaps most.
Yeah, and yeah, it was tough. It was a tough call to decide which was number one, but then we decided to stay with the potato truck scene in Frenzy. Also because, I mean, again, the whole sequence, it's a 12-minute long sequence of this serial rapist and murderer. And I mean, it's so absurd. He has forgotten the tie pie, his tie pie. He has forgotten it on this woman corpse. So he goes back and finds out the corpse is in a truck full of potatoes. And he goes in there, and the truck starts. They start driving the truck, and he's there, and he finds out the tie pie. She's holding the tie pie. So he starts like breaking every single one of the woman's fingers to recover the tie pie, because of course if they find the tie pie, they will find him. I mean, that's just genius.
It's a total genius. And by the way, when you look at the still frame, you're like, why did we pick that one? I mean, absolutely terrifying. But again, sorry, I'm being repetitive, but just look at the material, the purple color there, this kind of certain almost elegant texture to the materials around here. And again, you know, the woman, unfortunately, it's for a separate conversation of a separate time of Hitchcock's persistent theme of also violence against women, which in the modern discourse is probably one that is less welcome. You know, you can see again another young and vulnerable woman here in this image. But nonetheless, let's leave that as a separate conversation. But I completely agree. This you won a few special mentions, by the way, of creepy moments that didn't make it into the top 5, which we debated, but. You know, Rope, of course, with the simplistic imagery of those who haven't seen it, of an entire drinks party, again, in a very elegant setting, surrounded with all these sophisticated people who come together to have drinks, all the while there's a dead body that they don't realize that's sitting right there. And again, that kind of subversive, playful almost approach to death and the macabre, but in the kind of supposedly sophisticated setting, was another one of, let's say, my favorites, or both of our favorites watching it, but didn't quite make it into the top 5 because it hasn't got one single iconic, let's say, creepy image.
Yeah.
It's like most of them. It's a full 90 minutes of it. So, yeah.
True. Okay, so that was pretty much it.
It feels terrible every time we feel like we've had a conversation. We're having a conversation about Hitchcock. I feel like we just started the conversation. I feel like now we can go into much more. I feel bad. It's you could do it for hours.
True. We can go on in December when we meet.
Yeah, exactly, for sure.
Anyway, Olivier, thank you very much for joining us and for accepting the invitation. And
thank you.
Yeah, I don't
a
know
real pleasure.
If there are some people with some comments or questions or.
Okay, in the chat right now we don't have comments or questions. Professor Juan
Pablo. Everyone is fearful.
Yes.
Frightened to death.
100%. Or maybe they have the same internet provider that I do.
True. That's another option. But yeah, and can you just tell us what are you doing at the moment? What's your what projects are you developing currently?
Yeah, for sure. We're currently about to go into production on our biggest production so far. It's a film that we're doing with. It's our first studio film, actually, with Universal Pictures, with their Focus Features, which is their more independent arm, and the British production company Working Title, who, of course, were very famous back in the 90s. They did 4 Weddings and a Funeral and Notting Hill, and of course, since then have done all the Coen brothers films and every big British film you've seen. So very much not in the Hitchcock space. It's a comedy So it doesn't follow well from this particular conversation, but it's an exciting one.
Filmmaking is a creepy profession, that's for sure.
It's a very creepy profession. But then again, the filmmaker we're working with is she's a Pakistani British filmmaker called Nida Manzoor. She had a TV show out this year called We Are Lady Parts, and there you have a similar type of not obsession but recurrent themes. For her it's the fight against patriarchy, and for Hitchcock it was just fear as a whole. But you'll find that it's always exciting working with filmmakers that have consistent themes throughout their work. So yeah, this is an action comedy about a young girl saving her older sister from an arranged marriage by hijacking her wedding with her friends. And so this will be filming. We start filming in 2 weeks, knock on wood, and then we wrap, and hopefully it'll come out later next year.
Okay, good luck with your project, and thank you again for accepting our invitation to Cátedra Europa.
Thank you very much. It was an absolute pleasure. I'm always happy to talk Hitchcock, so invite me back anytime.
Okay. Bye. See you. Thank you, Luis.
See you. Bye.
So we thank our special guests for the participation and all the attendees for joining us in this session of Cátedra Europa. We invite you to continue supporting the education talented students through our scholarship fundraising campaign, Más Becas, by clicking on the donation button on the homepage of Cátedra Europa. We also encourage you to stay connected to the rest of Cátedra Europa events. Have a nice day.